The air in the Coronado amphibious base training facility was a thick soup of human effort. It smelled of sweat, hot metal, chalk, and the faint, ozonic tang of electricity from the rows of mercilessly efficient treadmills. It was an atmosphere brewed for a specific kind of man, a place where weakness was sweated out, ground out, and beaten out until only strength remained. This was a cathedral of modern warfare, and its parishioners were the elite, the Navy SEALs. Their prayers were the rhythmic clang of iron plates, the percussive slam of rubberized weights on reinforced flooring, and the guttural shouts of exertion that were more animal than human. Everything was new. The equipment gleamed with matte black and polished chrome finishes, polymers and carbon fiber replacing the old ghosts of iron and wood. Digital readouts glowed in stark reds and blues, tracking heart rates, repetitions, and power output with cold, impartial precision. The very walls seemed to buzz with a low-frequency hum of power, a testament to the cutting-edge technology that honed these men into the sharpest instruments of American will. And through this temple of peak physical prowess, an old man moved like a ghost from another time. His name was Elias Vance, though few, if any, knew it. To the titans who trained here, he was simply the janitor. He pushed a wheeled, yellow bucket that looked ancient beside the state-of-the-art machinery. The gray fabric of his uniform was worn thin at the elbows and knees, softened by 1,000 washings. It hung loosely on his stooped frame, a stark contrast to the skin-tight performance wear that adorned the gym's occupants. His hair was a wisp of white, a fragile crown above a face that was a roadmap of a life lived long and hard. Deep lines radiated from the corners of his pale blue eyes, channels carved by sun and salt and time. His movements were a study in economy, slow and deliberate, honed not by a desire for efficiency but by the simple mechanics of age. Each sweep of his mop was a long, patient arc. He worked his way around the hulking machines and the even more hulking men with a quiet deference that rendered him nearly invisible. He was part of the building's ambient noise, like the hum of the ventilation or the distant cry of gulls from the bay, present but unnoticed. He never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his answers were soft and brief, swallowed by the cavernous acoustics of the weight room. He was a relic in a world that had no time for history. Lieutenant Commander Cade "Razor" Jennings had no time for history. He had time for results. Cade stood at the center of the gym floor, an apex predator in his domain. At 29, he was the embodiment of the new breed. His body was a masterpiece of functional muscle, sculpted by science and fueled by a diet measured to the last calorie. His uniform was so crisp it looked like it could cut glass. His gaze, sharp and analytical, swept over his men as they moved through a punishing circuit he had designed himself. Look at them, he thought, a surge of proprietary pride swelling in his chest. My team. The sharpest tip of the spear. He saw reflections of himself in their intensity, in their unyielding focus. They were faster, stronger, and more technologically integrated than any generation of warriors before them. They were the future, and he was its architect. His eyes flicked past the old janitor. The man was a smudge in his peripheral vision, a gray blur of slow, pointless motion. Cade felt a flicker of irritation, a minor but persistent annoyance, like a single fly buzzing in a sterile operating room. The old man's very presence was an affront to the dynamism of the space. He was entropy in a world of explosive energy. He was slow. He was old. He was irrelevant. Rook. Pick up the pace. Cade's voice was a blade, cutting through the gym's noise. You're not here to make friends with the kettlebell. Own it. A young petty officer, his face a mask of strained effort, grunted in acknowledgement and quickened his reps. Cade nodded, satisfied. Discipline was everything. Complacency was death. He preached it. He lived it. Elias, meanwhile, finished mopping a section of the floor near the free weights. He placed a small, yellow, wet floor sign with the care of a man setting a delicate piece of china. The plastic was cracked and faded, the black lettering worn away in places. It was another artifact from a forgotten era. Cade's circuit required his team to move between stations with explosive speed. One of his men, a bull of a seal named Ox, was transitioning from the bench press to the rope climb. He didn't see the sign. His tactical boot, its sole designed for gripping the deck of a hostile ship, skidded on the still damp floor. For a split second, his balance faltered. He recovered instantly, his powerful core muscles correcting the slip, but the momentary break in his rhythm was a cardinal sin in Cade's world. Cade's attention snapped to the cause of the disruption. The old man. The sign. The wet floor. You, Cade barked, his voice cracking with authority. He didn't know the janitor's name, and he had no interest in learning it. You. Mop jockey. Over here. Now. Elias turned his head slowly. His pale blue eyes, calm as a deep ocean, met Cade's. He didn't speak. He simply began to push his cart, the wheels squeaking a mournful protest, toward the lieutenant commander. The journey across the 20 yards of rubberized floor seemed to take an eternity. Each slow, shuffling step grated on Cade's last nerve. Is he deaf? Or just stupid? Cade's internal monologue was a torrent of condescension. This is what happens. People get old. They get slow. They become obstacles. They should be at home, sitting in a chair, not getting underfoot in a place like this. Elias finally stopped a respectful few feet from the officer. He stood with his hands resting lightly on the handle of his pushcart, his posture stooped but his spine possessed of a certain dignity. He waited. Did you see what you just did? Cade demanded, gesturing angrily toward Ox, who had already begun his ascent up the thick rope. My men almost went down. On your wet floor. During a combat readiness drill. Elias's gaze drifted to the yellow sign he had placed. It was clearly visible. Then his eyes returned to Cade. I put up the sign, sir, he said. His voice was quiet, a dry rustle of leaves. The simple, factual statement enraged Cade. It felt like defiance cloaked in politeness. It was the passive resistance of the powerless, and it was infuriating. The sign. Cade scoffed, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. He was aware of his team pausing, their attention now fixed on the confrontation. An audience. Good. They needed to see this. They needed to see that standards applied to everyone, that no inefficiency, no matter how small, would be tolerated. We are not mopping up a spill in a grocery store, old man, Cade said, his voice dripping with scorn. He took a step closer, invading Elias's personal space. The old janitor didn't flinch. He just stood there, breathing slowly, his presence as immovable as a mountain. This is a Tier 1 operational training facility. The men in this room are the most lethal fighting force on the planet. Their focus cannot be broken. Do you understand the concept of operational tempo? Of maintaining momentum? Elias offered no reply. He simply watched the younger men, his expression unreadable. Of course you don't, Cade continued, answering his own rhetorical question. His arrogance was a polished, impenetrable shield. You're just here to push him up. But let me educate you. Your job is to be invisible. Your job is to clean when we are not here. When you are forced to be here, you stay out of the way. You do not create hazards. You do not interrupt the flow. Is that clear? Yes, sir. The words were barely a whisper, yet they held no trace of fear or submission. They were just an acknowledgement. This clinical calmness only stoked Cade's fire. He wanted deference. He wanted a bowed head, a stammered apology. He wanted the old man to shrink, to validate Cade's own towering sense of importance. The janitor's quiet dignity was a silent rebuke to his authority, and he couldn't stand it. It's Lieutenant Commander, Cade snapped. You will address me by my rank. Yes, Lieutenant Commander. Still no change in his tone. Still that unnerving calm. Cade felt his control slipping. He was used to commanding respect, to having his orders followed with snap precision. This old man's placid exterior was like a mirror, reflecting his own escalating anger back at him, and he didn't like the image. He needed to reassert his dominance, to break that placid surface. He reached out and jabbed a finger at Elias's chest. This is your one and only warning. You get in my team's way again, you interfere with our training in any capacity, and I will personally walk you to the front gate and make sure you never set foot on this base again. We have no room for dead weight here. The threat hung in the air, heavy and ugly. The gym had fallen completely silent, save for the hum of the lights. Every SEAL had stopped their workout. They were all watching their leader dress down a stooped, elderly janitor. Some shifted uncomfortably. This felt different from Cade's usual demanding nature. This felt personal. It felt cruel. Elias's eyes flickered down to the finger pressed against his sternum, then back up to Cade's face. For the first time, a shadow of something crossed his features, not fear, but a deep, weary sadness. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Cade, feeling he had finally made his point, pulled his hand back. He felt a swell of victory, the satisfying rush of having crushed a minor insurrection. He had reinforced the hierarchy. He had made his point. Now get back to work, he commanded, his tone dismissive. And stay out of the way. He turned his back on Elias, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and faced his team. All right, ladies, show's over. Let's get back to it. The world ain't gonna save itself. The sounds of the gym slowly resumed, but the energy had shifted. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a tense, awkward silence between sets. The men avoided looking at Elias as he slowly pushed his squeaky cart toward the locker rooms, his form seeming smaller, more fragile than before. He had become an obstacle, a piece of dead weight. A ghost from another time, haunting a world that no longer had a place for him. Days turned into a week. The incident was not forgotten. It lingered in the air like the metallic scent of iron. Lieutenant Commander Jennings, if anything, grew more imperious. He seemed to have taken the silent confrontation as a victory that needed reinforcing. He went out of his way to find fault with Elias's work. A spot of dust on a windowsill. A streak left on a mirror. A trash can not emptied with sufficient alacrity. Each perceived failure was met with a sharp, public rebuke. Cade treated Elias not as a man, but as a malfunctioning piece of equipment. He never used his name. It was always Janitor, Old Man, or a sharp, commanding you. The SEALs under Cade's command watched with growing unease. These were hard men, accustomed to a brutal and unforgiving world, but they were also bound by a code. Respect was a pillar of that code. They respected the chain of command, they respected the enemy's capabilities, and they respected their elders. What Cade was doing felt like a violation. It was bullying, plain and simple, and it was directed at a man who offered no resistance. Elias, for his part, absorbed the abuse with the same unnerving stoicism. He would listen to Cade's tirades, his pale eyes fixed on the officer's face, and when the verbal assault was over, he would offer a quiet, "Yes, Lieutenant Commander," and attend to the complaint. He never argued. He never showed anger. He never showed anything. His placid endurance became a strange sort of legend among the younger SEALs. They started watching him more closely. They saw the tremor in his hands as he lifted a heavy bag of trash, but they also saw the steady, unwavering line of his shoulders. They saw him pause to catch his breath after mopping the long hallway, but they also saw that he never cut a single corner, cleaning every inch of the facility with a meticulousness that bordered on ritual. He was a puzzle. A quiet, gray man who absorbed the vitriol of a decorated SEAL commander as a sea cliff absorbs the crashing of waves, unmoved, unchanging, patient. The breaking point came on a Thursday. It was Hell Day for a new group of trainees, and the facility was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Cade's team was tasked with demonstrating a complex hostage rescue drill, involving fast roping from the rafters and a simulated room clearing. The entire gym floor was their stage. Elias was cleaning the observation deck, a glassed-in mezzanine that overlooked the main floor. He was wiping down the inside of the large windows, his back to the activity below. His movements were, as always, slow and methodical. Down below, Cade was in his element. He barked orders, his voice a metronome setting the pace for the intricate dance of violence. The drill was going perfectly. His men moved with the fluid lethality that was their trademark. Target neutralized. Hostage secure, came the call from the team leader inside the mock-up room. Cade allowed himself a grim smile. Excellent. Reset for Scenario 2. As the team began to exit the room, Cade's eyes swept the facility, checking every angle, a habit ingrained through years of training. His gaze traveled up to the observation deck. And there he was. The old janitor. A gray smudge against the glass. In Cade's mind, inflamed with the intensity of the drill, Elias's presence was a contamination. A civilian, a slow, useless old man, looking down on his elite team. It was a breach of sanctity. What right did this floor sweeper have to observe them? You. Cade's voice boomed through the cavernous space, amplified by the acoustics. On the mezzanine. Get out of there. Now. Elias stopped wiping the window. He turned slowly, his silhouette framed against the bright light from outside. He looked down at the lieutenant commander. This area is now a sterile training environment. Cade shouted, his anger disproportionate, almost theatrical. He was performing for the trainees now, as well as his own men. That means essential personnel only. You are not essential. Get your gear and get out of my gym. Not just the deck, the entire building. He was, in effect, firing him from the room. Elias didn't move. He simply stood and watched. This final act of silent, perceived defiance broke something in Cade. All his frustration, all his professional arrogance, all his deep-seated annoyance at this quiet, unbreakable old man, coalesced into a single point of pure fury. Did you hear me? He roared, striding toward the stairs that led to the mezzanine. I gave you a direct order. He took the stairs two at a time, his boots hammering on the metal treads. His men watched, frozen. This had gone too far. This was no longer about discipline. This was a vendetta. Cade burst onto the observation deck. He marched directly to Elias, his face flushed with rage. He was several inches taller and outweighed the old man by a solid 100 pounds of muscle. He loomed over him like a storm cloud. Are you deaf? Are you insubordinate? I told you to get out. Elias looked at him. His expression was still calm, but his pale eyes seemed to be seeing something far away, something beyond the enraged face of the young officer before him. I am just finishing, Elias said, his voice a low murmur. You are finished, all right, Cade snarled. He reached out, not to jab this time, but to grab. He seized the collar of Elias's gray uniform, intending to physically drag him from the deck. You're done here. For good. The motion was rough, violent. The worn fabric of the collar pulled tight against the old man's throat. And it revealed the tattoo. It was on the left side of his neck, just below his ear. It was a faint, blurred marking, its lines softened and its color faded to a pale, greenish-blue by decades of sun and age. It was barely decipherable, a ghost of an image. A cartoonish-looking frog, holding a stick of dynamite. The touch, the aggressive grab, the angry shouting face so close to his own, it was a switch. For Elias, the gym dissolved. The smell of sweat and metal was replaced by the cold, biting scent of salt and diesel fuel. The fluorescent lights became the pre-dawn gray of a Korean sky. The shouts of the lieutenant commander became the roaring engines of a landing craft and the percussive crump of distant artillery. He felt the phantom chill of 38-degree water seeping into his bones, the rough texture of a limpet mine under his numb fingers. Clear the channel, Vance. No matter what. The voice of his long-dead officer echoed in his mind, as clear as if he were standing beside him. Cade saw the tattoo. He didn't understand it. To him, it was just a crude, ugly mark, probably a drunken mistake from a port call in some forgotten corner of the world half a century ago. He sneered. What is that supposed to be? Some kind of jumping frog? Pathetic. He tightened his grip, ready to haul the old man away. Let's go. Your tour of duty here is over. That's enough, Lieutenant Commander. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension on the mezzanine like a diamond blade through glass. It carried an effortless authority that Cade's manufactured rage could never hope to match. Cade froze, his hand still gripping Elias's collar. He turned. Standing at the top of the stairs was Captain Wallace, the base commander. He was a tall, lean man in his late 50s, his face weathered but his eyes sharp and intelligent. He wore the 4 broad stripes of his rank on his collar, and his presence instantly sucked all the air out of the room. He had been making his weekly rounds and had heard the shouting from the hallway. The seals on the floor below snapped to attention. Cade immediately let go of Elias's uniform and straightened up, his hand flying to his brow in a salute. Captain. I was just removing a civilian from the training area, sir. Captain Wallace's eyes were not on Cade. They were fixed on the faded blue-green tattoo on the janitor's neck. He walked past Cade as if the younger officer were a coat rack, his gaze locked on Elias. A strange expression crossed the captain's face, a mixture of disbelief, awe, and profound, overwhelming respect. He stopped directly in front of Elias. The janitor, pulled from his reverie by the new voice, looked at the captain. His breathing was a little ragged, but his eyes were clear. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other. The old janitor and the base commander. Then, Captain Wallace did something that sent a shockwave through every man watching. He snapped his heels together. His back went ramrod straight. He raised his hand to his brow in the sharpest, most precise salute he had ever rendered in his 30 years of service. It was a salute reserved for heroes, for legends, for Medal of Honor recipients. "Mr. Vance," Captain Wallace said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is an absolute honor, sir." The title, Mr., was the final, baffling detail. It was a formal address, one that, in certain naval contexts, signified a level of respect that transcended the normal rank structure. Cade stared, his mouth agape. His mind struggled to process the scene. The base commander was saluting the janitor. He was calling him sir. It was an inversion of the universe as he knew it. "Captain." Cade stammered, his own authority evaporating into nothing. "Sir, I don't understand." He's the janitor." Captain Wallace slowly lowered his salute, but he did not take his eyes off Elias. He finally turned his head, and the look he gave Cade was one of pure, unadulterated contempt. It was a look that could strip paint. "Lieutenant Commander," Wallace said, his voice dangerously low. "You are a graduate of the Academy. You are a student of naval history. Or are you? Tell me, have you ever heard of the underwater demolition teams?" "Yes, sir," Cade said automatically. "The UDTs. They were the precursors to the SEALs." "The precursors," Wallace repeated, his voice laced with ice. "They were not precursors, Jennings. They were the foundation. They were the men who forged the very idea of naval special warfare in the frozen hell of the Pacific and the muddy waters of Korea. They did it with canvas scuba gear, with compasses that barely worked, and with nothing but raw courage to see them through. They wrote the book that you and your men think you've perfected." He gestured toward Elias. "This janitor is Elias Vance. And that pathetic jumping frog on his neck is the insignia of UDT-12. Does the name, Ghost of Incheon, mean anything to you, Lieutenant Commander?" Cade's face went white. Every man on the floor who heard the name felt a jolt. The Ghost of Incheon was a legend. A story told to trainees at BUD/S to inspire them, to show them the absolute limit of human endurance and bravery. It was a foundational myth of the SEAL community. A frogman, operating alone for 2 nights in the heavily mined, tide-swept waters of Incheon Harbor, single-handedly clearing a channel for the Marine landings. A man who swam through freezing water, disarming Soviet-made mines by hand in near-total darkness, with North Korean patrols sweeping the waters around him. The story was always told as if about a mythical figure, a nameless hero from the dawn of their trade. "The ghost, that was a real person," one of the younger SEALs whispered from the floor. Wallace's sharp hearing caught it. He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Oh, he was real. And he's been cleaning your toilets for the last 15 years. He turned back to Cade, his eyes blazing. "You stand here in your $40,000 worth of tactical gear, with your GPS and your high-speed comms, and you dare to lecture this man on operational tempo. This man is operational tempo. He is the standard by which every one of us, myself included, is measured and found wanting." Wallace stepped closer to Cade, his voice dropping to a furious whisper. "I read the citation for his Navy Cross when I was a midshipman. I memorized it. Let me see if I can recall." He closed his eyes for a second, then began to speak, his voice ringing with the formal, powerful cadence of an official commendation. "For extraordinary heroism on the night of September 13, 1950, as a member of a reconnaissance element during the amphibious assault at Incheon, Korea. Volunteering for a mission of extreme peril, Seaman Elias Vance swam alone into the heavily defended enemy harbor. For over 7 hours, in frigid, treacherous tidal currents and under the constant threat of discovery, he located and neutralized 17 enemy contact mines, clearing a vital channel for the main assault force. On the following night, he again voluntarily entered the harbor to mark the cleared lane, using shielded chemical lights while enemy patrol boats passed within mere yards of his position. His audacious courage, exceptional skill, and utter disregard for his own safety were critical to the success of the Incheon landings and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. As the captain spoke, the sterile Jim fell away again for Elias. This time, the memory was complete. He was 20 years old, wiry and tough, his body fueled by nervous energy and bad coffee. The water was so cold it felt like a physical blow, stealing his breath and clarity. His world was reduced to the black, silty water, the looming, horn shape of a mine, and the delicate, terrifying task of finding the arming mechanism with fingers that had lost all feeling. He remembered the scrape of a patrol boat's hull passing directly over his head, so close he could have reached out and touched it. He had held his breath until his lungs burned, pressing himself into the muddy seabed, praying they wouldn't see the faint trail of his own air bubbles. He remembered the profound, isolating loneliness of being the only friendly soul for miles, a single, fragile human being holding the fate of a massive invasion in his numb hands. He remembered taping the last chemical light to the channel marker, his mission complete, and feeling not triumph, but a wave of exhaustion so profound he wasn't sure he had the strength to swim back. He had succeeded, but a part of him, the boy he had been left behind in that cold, dark water. Wallace finished his recitation. The gym was utterly, profoundly silent. The weight of the words, of the history they represented, settled over the room. The gleaming, modern equipment suddenly looked frivolous, like toys. The muscular, formidable SEALs looked like boys playing dress-up. Cade Jennings stood as if turned to stone. The entire architecture of his world, his belief in his own superiority, in the supremacy of the new ways over the old, had been demolished in the space of 2 minutes. The men he had humiliated, threatened, and physically assaulted was not a janitor. He was a titan. He was a piece of living history whose boots Cade was not worthy to clean. The shame was a physical thing. It burned in his gut and rose up his throat, hot and acidic. He couldn't look at Elias. He couldn't look at the captain. He couldn't look at his own men. He stared at the floor, his world shattered. Finally, Wallace turned his full attention back to the young officer. You disrespected a legend of the naval service. You disrespected a man who bled for the very freedoms that allow you to stand here today. But more than that, you disrespected your own uniform, Lieutenant Commander. You failed the most fundamental test of leadership, to see the men, not the station. You are relieved of your command. Effective immediately. Report to my office at 1400. We will discuss your future, which, I assure you, will now involve a great deal of quiet, solitary time to reflect on naval history. He turned from the broken officer and faced Elias Vance once more. His expression softened from righteous anger to gentle reverence. Mr. Vance. Elias. I am so profoundly sorry for the disrespect you have been shown here. Elias finally spoke. His voice, when it came, was the same quiet, dry rustle as always. He's a good officer, Captain, Elias said, looking at the top of Cade's bowed head. He pushes his men hard. That's what they need. He paused, and a flicker of a smile touched his lips. It was the first time any of them had seen it. He's just young. That simple act of grace was the final, devastating blow. It was a forgiveness Cade had not earned and did not deserve, and it was more humiliating than any punishment. It was the quiet, unassuming strength of a true giant, swatting away the fury of an insect. The fallout was swift and decisive. Lieutenant Commander Cade Jennings was reassigned to a dreary desk at the Pentagon, tasked with archiving historical mission reports from the Korean War. It was a purgatory of paper and dust, a sentence designed by Captain Wallace to be educational. He was not discharged. Elias had quietly spoken to the captain and asked for leniency, a request that Wallace, humbled, had immediately granted. Back at Coronado, things changed. Captain Wallace instituted a new mandatory weekly history lesson for all personnel. They covered the birth of the Frogmen, the exploits of the OSS Maritime Unit in World War II, and, in the very first session, the full, declassified story of the Ghost of Incheon. The program became known, unofficially, as the Vance Protocol. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that the technology and the training were worthless without an understanding of the giants on whose shoulders they stood. Elias Vance was offered immediate retirement with full honors. He was offered a pension, a ceremony, a place of esteem. He politely declined. He said he liked the work. He liked the routine. So he remained. but he was no longer invisible. The seals, once oblivious to him, now treated him with a reverence that bordered on worship. They made sure his coffee cup was always full. They cleared paths for him without being asked. Young trainees would approach him, hesitant and shy, and ask him to tell them a story. He rarely did, but sometimes he would stop his work, look at the eager young face, and offer a small piece of advice. "The water is always colder than you think," he'd say. Or, "Fear is just a compass. It points you where you need to go." These cryptic fragments were treated like scripture. 6 months passed. One evening, long after the last seal had left the gym, Elias was finishing his rounds. He was wiping down the mirrors, which now reflected only his own aged face and the silent, sleeping machines. He heard the door to the gym open. A man in civilian clothes stood there, silhouetted against the hallway light. He was holding a small, framed object in his hands. It was Cade Jennings. He had lost the sharp, arrogant edge he once carried. His shoulders were slumped, his face humbled. He had driven down from a temporary assignment in San Diego just for this. He walked slowly over to Elias, stopping a few feet away. For a long moment, he said nothing. "They let me read the original report," Cade said finally, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former bluster. "The handwritten one you filed after the mission." Elias stopped wiping the mirror and turned to face him. "I spent the last 6 months reading about men like you," Cade continued. "Men who did the impossible with nothing. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. For my ignorance. For my arrogance." He held out the framed object. It was a high-quality photograph of the UDT 12-unit crest, the same cartoon frog that was tattooed on Elias's neck. Below it, on a small brass plate, was an inscription, "To Elias Vance, a founding father. With deepest respect." Elias looked at the frame, then at the young man holding it. He saw the genuine remorse in his eyes. He saw the hard-earned humility. He reached out with his wrinkled, steady hand and placed it on Cade's shoulder. "You're not so young anymore," Elias said softly. He then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of acceptance, of forgiveness, a quiet closing of a painful chapter. Cade nodded back, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He placed the frame on a nearby bench, turned, and walked out of the gym without another word, his lesson finally, truly learned. Elias watched him go. He then picked up his rag, turned back to the mirror, and continued his work, a quiet, unassuming man in a temple of heroes, unaware that the greatest of them all was the one who was simply, and contentedly, sweeping the floors. He was a ghost from another time, but now, he was a ghost they all saw, a silent, powerful reminder that the heart of a warrior is not measured by the volume of his voice or the gleam of his equipment, but by the quiet dignity of his service and the depth of his sacrifice.